Take it away.
Thank you much. Hey, thank you everyone for joining me after lunch. My name is Thomas Haver, and this is the Automation Firehose, Be Strategic and Tactical. This is sort of a hint of things to come. I like to go very thematic with my presentations, so this is Avengers themed. So in this session, if I were to go on longer and longer, and I'm also quite loquacious as a callback to Leon, I would talk a little bit more about the origin story for some of the test automation that's been in place for decades, as well as go into depth about some of the framework and tools you can use and some of the common challenges. But to fit in with our nice DevOps Days time box here, I'm going to go with just the essentials, choosing the choicest bits of material for you to talk about, which means metrics that no one likes to really talk about gets added in if you want the presentation later. So a little bit about myself. I work as a master software engineer for M&T Bank, and yes, that is my eye-rollingly arrogant title, MSE. I just refer to myself as a test automation architect. I'm a former scientist. I worked in research science for around a decade, studying molecular fluorescence spectroscopy and microscopy before I was pulled away into IT. I'm also an avid board gamer. I own more than 3,000 board games that take up a lot of space in 2 homes. And I'm an evangelist for Ruby Cucumber. I'm a big fan of behavior-driven development, and I sort of have a soft spot for it being the first sort of tool set that I used in the space. I've got a lovely cartoon family waiting for me at home. So let's dive in by level setting, creating a shared understanding with our origin story. When I say the strategy and tactics of test automation, what I'm specifically referring to from strategy is a plan of action or policy designed to achieve a major or overall aim, whereas tactics is the art or skill of employing your available means to actually reach that end. So for instance here, Star-Lord, he had a great strategy for defeating Thanos in Infinity War, but his own emotional tactics ended up costing his team, and half the universe was snapped. So even if you have a great strategy, unless you can tactically carry it out, you're going to fail. If you have good tactics without strategy, you're also likely going to be challenged. That likely ends up in the place where you have a single person or a set of people, sort of your champions carrying through with the automation, and once they move on, things regress. So let's go in the Wayback Machine. The challenges that we face today with test automation are not new, regardless of how big your company is. Let's use Microsoft, for example, and everyone's favorite now retired internet browser, Internet Explorer. Whenever they had to go through a release, their primary versions that they cared about was the version of the browser and the version of the operating system that they worked on. Well, that involved quite a bit of testing if they needed to achieve their goals. And then you multiply that by 26 different language binaries, and you reach a place of sort of impossibility if you want to verify everything that you truly care about before you go through a release. IE itself was very buggy. If anyone had to work on IE6 like I did, apologies, PTSD, and bringing up bad memories. So what did they do to actually try to address this, or at least mitigate some of their challenges? What we commonly consider today to be persona-based testing or risk-based testing, where you try to look at what are the most commonly used buckets or combinations, where are our customers using it, who generate the most revenue for us, and we're going to focus the personas based upon that and do our testing according to those from a prioritization standpoint. Because it doesn't matter if you're as large as Microsoft, you don't have infinite money, you don't have infinite time, you have to make the best call based upon the data you have available to yourself. The promise of automation has always been that it's going to save time and lower costs while raising quality. I've gone into multiple companies where they've asked that same thing, like, hey, we want to institute automation across the board, but you can't really impact our delivery schedule and you can't steal the time of our developers. All right, let me try to do this impossible task for you. In actuality, what you need to do is invest in automation like you would any other application. Going also into our Wayback Machine more than 20 years, to Alfredi Dustin's book, as an application ages, becomes brownfield. It becomes large and unwieldy. It becomes difficult for you to actually validate it. At a certain point, if you have test automation coverage across layers of that application, then wow, magically, your time to test decreases and you have better quality with your application. But it's not shown here as truly a discrete activity. It's not this yellow line of automation and you're done. It's something that once you invest in, you are investing in the maintenance of that code for its lifespan. It's a practice that you are investing in to carry out for the rest of that application's lifespan. So it's something that you need to develop as a skill set, just like anything else. When I generally try to help organizations, I try to apply these areas for developing their strategy at the outset to help level set, just like we did around those definitions, where we look at like what is the scope of the work on there, what are the ultimate objectives of the team or organization, what is the approach that we can take given the means we have available to us, what are some framework and tools that best apply to it, what are the different environments that we have to work in, right? How should we schedule this in? Planning in with when they expect to release, or post-automation, how more frequently they plan to release. And last and most importantly is the technical skill set of the people on those teams. If they're not able to carry it out tactically, then my strategy isn't going to work. So we start with the approach. When I want to go and work with teams, I want to try to create at least a ubiquitous approach to whether or not something can be automated. So I start off with the high level. I say, all right, let's start off with the perspective from multiple layers, starting with, say, our UI layer, if we have that in scope, and say, for any of our testers out there, or any of our developers who are writing automated tests, what is a set of criteria that you can use to judge whether or not a scenario should be automated? As in, what value is it actually going to provide you if you decide to automate this? And that's because I want, regardless of whom on a team or across multiple teams are answering that question, for them to apply the same exact standard. So what should we automate? I take that further in helping the teams level set with regards to the tooling that they're going to use. So I want them to consider the automation cost, that it's not something you sprinkle the magic fairy dust and you're good. Your automation script should be treated with the same care that you would expect of your development code. Automation code is development code. So you need to factor in maintenance costs for that, because once you've invested in it, you're taking care of that test for its lifespan. You need to also calculate in the cost for the automation tools, any OS upgrades, any language upgrades, and oh, by the way, like, you're not just going to immediately adopt this. You need to have onboarding materials. You need to train the people in place. These are all things that take away time and money that should be factored into that overall ROI calculation for us to do automation. To layer on top of the what should we automate, I like to let people know what are their organizational constraints. We're always going to be limited by our project budget, by our timeline, by the technical skill set. So let's work within that sort of framework where we're limited. We want to make sure to make that same call that was made decades ago, that we're going to automate based upon what is the frequency of use, the criticality of the path, any sort of legal risks that we have to adhere to, and use that as a prioritization, such that we can make that good call, that we can look at anything that's complex, anything that is troublesome for people or frustrating for them to do, and say, all right, this is a good target for automation. I like to make this real in the form of an automation scorecard. When those individual development teams are doing their work, I like to have them create a set of criteria and either use simple checkboxes as I have here, or have a scoring system that they can actually use dependent upon the feature we're working on. What criteria does it fit that we value? As in, is it something that's critical or frequently executed? Do we have legal compliant needs to have this be validated every time we release? There's a lot of data and environmental setup needed for it. And based upon those criteria, where I've either had teams do these simple checkboxes or do a rating scale from 0 to 10 for each one of them, you create a prioritized list. So of the work that you need to do, these are the most valuable areas. And knowing that we're always limited by time, these are the things we're going to focus on first and foremost. Those things that may not make the cut, either we have a dividing line for that, or we say we're going to automate everything. We've at least identified where we have technical debt if we decide to skip over things towards the bottom of the list. So they're not forgotten, they're at least something that's transparent. It can be in teams' backlogs. There's a lot of framework and tools that you can use regardless of whether you're doing unit testing, perf testing, API-based testing, functional testing. There's no one set of tools that are best, but there's sort of good advice that you can follow for it. So I mentioned I was a fan of Gherkin, so let's use some bad Gherkin here as an example. Something that you want to use if you're going to actually have total team collaboration and not just people who are working on automation solely or developers. This is a tool that would use Selenium to drive the browser. In this case, Ruby as the primary programming language, and Cucumber as your gem or package. that's going to be leveraged to write that plain English. I use this as an example for, say, Selenium, and that's because you want to try to align your current tech stack with any new tools that you're going to adopt for it. And that's because you're going to be facing challenges with adoption. Anytime you bring in net new tools, no matter how lovely it is to have these shiny new tools available to you, there's always going to be reticence to adopt them. So why not allow your developers to have one foot firmly in a place where they feel comfortable with, as in an existing language that they already program in, existing tool that they're already familiar with, and then have them extend out into that unknown of the test automation space. So Selenium is a good example of this because it's been implemented in every single popular language underneath the sun. So that makes it very easy, regardless of what flavor your programming language is, that you can actually leverage Selenium for web-based automation. So when you're going through tooling selection for your organization, whether it's to decide a perf testing tool or API tool, you want to try to line up the programming language for the application under test. Keep your tech stack small. It lowers those maintenance costs. It makes it easier to adopt. So I talked a little bit about functional automation, but to dive down through those layers without having to show you that testing pyramid, the higher focus should be on integration testing, where we want to look at those interfaces or modules and making a similar decision that we want to adopt a integration testing framework that's going to align closely with our tech stack. And regardless of what programming language is primary for the application, you can use that. So the API-based tests are faster run, of course, than your functional tests. They're easier to debug, and they're highly repeatable. So you should use that as a primary. And to take that farther, of course, everyone's favorite unit testing. So unit tests are, of course, like the fastest way that you can actually test that. Highly reusable, easier to debug. You can find it earlier, the so-called shift left, where if you find it earlier, it ends up costing less for defects. But ultimately, it's like you just don't want to have to go through rework. Personally, I don't actually like writing unit tests, and I hate that this is being recorded, so it has it on record. So, I've had to adopt some tooling to at least help myself out, and I'm trying to get others to do as well. So one of those examples is actually GitHub Copilot as an assistive technology that you can ask it to generate at least a template of unit tests for you while you're working, and then update, fill in the blanks. That way it gets you off of that sort of like blank page or blank screen effect of like, I have to write my unit test. Oh no, I don't want to do this. To, all right, here's something that I can work from and modify as sort of like existing code. And this goes back to my statement about framework and tools of trying to select something where you have a degree of comfort in building off of that. So too with unit tests, should you adopt a practice that starts in an area of comfort, whether it's using assistive technologies or as a practice, as in I love, Red Green Refactor. I've got a website, it's called Red Green Refactor. It's like you write the filling unit test first. That's still really tough to do as a general practice. It's okay to write your code and then write unit tests thereafter. And again, something else that can be recorded and used against me by my team members afterwards. So there's a lot of common challenges that I've encountered in helping out multiple organizations, hundreds of teams over the course of time. Generally, they fall into these buckets in supporting test automation. One of those is the eponymous automation Firehose. When I provide a tool to a team, they're adopting something brand new. All right, they think, all right, I'm gonna automate everything. Why? Because I can. But just because you can automate something doesn't mean that you should. You want to adopt that risk-based approach for automation, using automation scorecard, using the acceptance criteria for whether or not something is going to provide value for you. I would rather have 100 functional automated tests that pass at a high rate than 1,000 tests where 500 of those fail. We've all worked on those teams. What happens? All right, I get an email notification that says my execution report's ready for me because it's part of the build process. I've got a 500 set of failing tests, and it's a different set of 500 every time I look at it. So eventually, you just stop looking at it because you don't have any trust in the actual execution results, whether that's due to your own practices or the application itself. You've lost the purpose of actually having that test automation. So it's better to automate based upon what is going to provide you the greatest value, what is going to be something that's going to be highly repeatable for you, than to automate everything underneath the sun. Additionally, I see people committing to automation when they don't actually have full control of their systems. So they'll write a test, and it works in an environment. and then they'll promote it up to the next environment, and it will fail spectacularly because they didn't make it cross-environment compatible. When you write a test, if you think about like generating value, being able to write it once and have it execute, of course, many times across many different environments, across many different combinations or contexts, is going to provide you the most bang for your buck. So why would you write a test that's only going to work in one environment? What you want to do as an upfront is have full CRUD access to test data generation and manipulation, those source systems that you rely upon. In some cases, it calls on mocking out some of that actual data via service calls. But you need to have that as an upfront requirement, as in when you are pulling work into the team space, you already have access to this. You're not doing it in flight. Because what I've seen that happen very common is teams will start to work on something and they realize, oh, we have these blockers we didn't consider when we agreed to pull in this work. There goes our sprint goals. We're not going to hit those now. Or the team that we need to rely on has about like a 2-week SLA to actually get back to us to solve this. So you should make test static generation and manipulation an upfront concern, a ready state criteria. Additionally, I've gone into many organizations and I've looked through their test beds, and I have the same sort of reaction that you had when they opened up the Ark in Indiana Jones, just face meltingly bad. And that's because they'll write incredibly terrible tests that I look at that will pass, I execute again, fail, pass, fail, flickering, like I said, of Christmas lights. So when you have those flickering tests, take them out, because people will stop trusting in the test results. That is automation technical debt that you've accrued. You need to determine the source of that failure. Is it due to data, environment, the application itself, your own bad code practices? Oh no. You know, whatever the reason is, you don't want to have a flickering test in your test bed. You want to address it. It should either be something that passes at a high rate, because this is a confirmation or a check that you're doing, or it should be something that is actually better as a manual test. So remove those flickering tests, aka those flaky tests from your suite. You need to fix them or send them away. The other area where I see common challenges are with long tests. 300 line long tests that assert a dozen different things. And what happens when you fail at that first assert? You skip the rest and you go to the next test. So not only do you have a failure to investigate, you have 11 additional blind spots to address. So what you need to do is apply those same principles that you would have with, say, unit tests that you would with integration tests and functional tests. You need to make sure that you're asserting one thing per type of test. You also need to put your prioritization on unit over integration, on integration over those UI, and then have enough end-to-end tests to verify the end user behavior. Additionally, and this applies to development code as it does for test beds as well, is we build our work on shaky foundations. Our goal is to get done for this sprint, to just get that state of done. So you know what, I'll make some sacrifices. I know this isn't written the best, but you know what, it's done. And you keep on doing that and accruing more technical debt, sprint over sprint, project over project, until your suite is unusable. There's almost more maintenance work than there is actual testing work associated with it. So you need to make your automation extensible. You need to follow those same sort of best practices like dry, kiss, that you would expect with your own development code. You need to plan for the day that you're not going to be there to fix it and someone else is going to have to do that. So you want to build on a strong foundation. Lastly, I've seen areas where we do development work and we're so-called done at the end of a sprint or time box. And then the testing work begins in the sprint or time box after that. How is the work done if we haven't actually validated it? You need to have your automation going concurrently with your development work. That means incorporating automation execution, at least an environment, into your definition of done. The upfront criteria that you'd have of having control of the data, of writing that automated test, should be in like your definition of ready, that you need to make sure that this is done together as one. Now, you can of course have some lag between when you can actually see the automation test pass and when it fails initially because you don't have the development work done. But good, we need to have that work all occurring in the same sprint. We can't say we're done with our work if we're not actually done with it. Right. There's a few things that you can adopt from a quality standards perspective that I recommend teams use. Up to this point, I've shown you a lot of Avengers, but here's my personal superhero, Martin Fowler. said, I'm not a great programmer. I'm just a good programmer with great habits. So why do we apply different standards for testing, test automation that we do with our development work? We should apply those same exact standards. So for instance, we should expect code reviews for our test automation. Practice what you preach. We should make sure that we follow all the team agreed upon standards, that it's understandable by the folks within the team, that you can execute across those environments, that it's gone through pull review requests just the same way as you would expect anyone else. In some cases, I like to have the automation code live directly with the development code base. In other cases where they have to keep it separate, like some of the functional automation that you have, it's okay, but you want to apply the same standards for pull review requests that you would for your development code as you would for your test automation. Tie the definition of done to having your automation done and reviewed the same way you would your development code. Additionally, you should practice regular refactoring sessions with your test automation code, fitting in with the guidelines that we want our automation to be maintainable, we want it to be extensible, and reflect the domain knowledge of that application under test. The areas that we will look for in these sessions based upon performance, implementing non-orthogonal design, stripping out that outdated knowledge, and removing any sources of duplication we could have. We want our automation suite to be small. So it's smaller, that means it's easier to maintain. We want it to be something that people can easily onboard and use, and not some unwieldy beast that is thousands upon thousands of lines long. For instance, a lot of these suites that I use, whether it's working with database, mobile, web, just use on the order of like 300 or so lines of code just for the underneath portion. The tests themselves can go up to many thousands, but the glue code that you have underneath the covers, it's kept intentionally small and simple. Why? I don't want to maintain it. I don't want to have people be confused about what the code does. I want it to be simple for them to extend. But I can say, hey, you should use refactoring sessions. How do you actually make that real? The way that I found best in making it real is making it independent of a person, making it a team responsibility, making it something that is regular, say half an hour every week for the team, and you have roles. One is your team lead. So this is someone responsible for scheduling that session, for delegating the work that we have as action items, whether those be spikes or actual stories after, and selecting a given focus area for your refactoring session. You want to have an automation guide. This could be the technical oracle internally, as in within the team who knows the most about it, or someone external from the team, so you get an equivalent of a peer review during this. This is going to be a person responsible for tracking the session, as in who's attending, what areas are we working on, what action items did the team agree to, as well as improvement status reports. We want to show that as our automation suite is growing larger, because we're developing new work for application, we're at least staying steady for our level of quality or increasing. Lastly, the area that you want to focus on can switch from session to session, whether it's going to be code metric reports, given feature item, project release, regression, CI report, something from the logs. This keeps it fresh. So you could have new or junior members of the team want to work on refactoring for the work that they've directly done, going beyond a pull review request to having the team provide that guidance. More senior, you can look at where do we have common trouble spots with our application. Those are going to be the areas where we're going to focus on for our refactoring sessions. Making it real for them to have, instead of just say refactoring, but we are actually going to devote time as a team to do it, having them all participate is excellent when you talk about sharing that knowledge. It's excellent in terms of holding everyone accountable and ensuring quality of your application. And you end up making it independent of one person acting as that champion to go and support it. So in summary, what did we learn here today? Well, for one, following that test pyramid still matters. Like, we care mostly about unit tests as a priority, our service level tests secondary. UI tests are still important because we care about the end user behavior if UI applies to you. And then those end-to-end tests. Those end-to-end tests are the ones that are going to be the most challenging for you or for any organization because you have to work across multiple systems. This will be that great opportunity for you from an automation standpoint to apply those standards across multiple teams to make end-to-end testing easier. Secondarily, you want to build based upon the probability of failure, the impact on the business, and the complexity. You can't automate everything, nor should you automate everything. You want to automate those things that are going to provide you the greatest value and work your way down that list. And lastly, you're always going to be limited by your budget, by the schedule, and the technical skill set. Instead of complaining about it, instead of giving up, work within those bounds, work within those constraints, show that value, and then maybe you can go back and work with your leadership on getting additional budget that's needed, changing a team's process, but work from a position of strength, which is you showing that value. I want to finish this off before we go into questions with my little pitch for my company. It's M&T Bank. M&T Tech is just the branding for it. We are hiring hundreds of people. We have additional open roles. If you're interested, we are headquartered in Wilmington, Delaware, and Buffalo, New York. So my fellow snow bros here in Denver, you can live in Buffalo as well and experience a different type of snow, aka lake effect. So feel free to check it out if you want to. Thank you very much for your time, and open to questions.
Great talk. Did you draw the pictures yourself?
I'd say yes and no. So some are line traced, some are self-drawn, and some are drawn by my friend Damian Sinadinos. He of Ineffable Solutions. So it's a combination. If you look up my name, you'll see a lot of presentations that are similar in terms of like RPA talk. All the robots you could possibly think of from popular culture are there.
Cool, thanks. I had the same question as Peter, so now I have to ask a better question, I guess. But that's so cool. They're great slides. You mentioned that the end-to-end tests can be some of the hardest to implement. It also reminds me of the sort of evolving methodology that people have in testing in production, like getting real data about the systems and sort of that whole missing continuum from people's test pyramid. Could you talk a little bit about the nuance of just how to deal with how expensive and how sticky these sorts of testing techniques can be?
Yeah, so I'd say it's more expensive to not validate that. And there's things that you can do from a metric perspective, and I'd say I've provided the organizers with the full deck in terms of some metrics that will show that if you're going to ignore it, let's just say we just skip on the testing period, you can track those escape defects and provide different forms of cost to it, whether that's reputational risk or actual cost of rework to fix this. There's others that you can show that as you accrue more defects in your lower environments, because maybe either from a configuration standpoint that you've set up or the actual application itself, that ends up delaying your ability to actually validate and push to production. And so having your lower environments be as close to production as possible is a high priority. Having full access to your data is a high priority. And then for the intent testing, what does this actually involve? Well, a lot of it involves the refresh schedules that a lot of teams are on. Like, hey, we do our regular refresh every Monday morning and a different team does it on a different day. So you end up losing multiple days worth of potential work because teams are not aligned on the same schedule. To really support intent testing, to make it valuable, you have to get teams to sync up their time, to sync up their data, and then to collaborate on the testing that needs to occur. Now, this is where you can run into some challenges. All right, so if you have teams, different tech stacks, of course, they all have their own form of automation tests. So how do you create intent tests that go between them? Some of it you can handle with declarative pipelines that say pass data from one to the other. You know, you have a sort of temporary store. In other instances, it actually helps to align in your test automation solution to provide that value. But there are things from pure money cost to time cost you have on there to frustration to lack of releases. Within my company, like there's a group right now that they're talking about, like they can't even do a monthly release because the lag times that were generated from environment issues, data issues, getting all their teams on board, and then executing your combination of manual automated tests is greater than 4 weeks. But they still have 2-week sprints. So how does that make sense? Like if you have this ability to quote unquote release every 2 weeks, but you can't actually do that, that's sort of a, you're telling a lie to yourself. So you need to look at where you have those constraints in the system. Like, hey, if you have these 179 tests that should be automated, if you automate them, that saves you 2 to 3 days worth of time instead of having them be manually validated by an offshore team. Or If you have the exact same environmental configuration, low environment to high, then great. Like, it makes it easier to have confidence once you're done in your highest environment that once it goes to prod, you're going to be okay. So I could go on and on, but I will not because we're at time here. And so I'll thank you very much. If you want to have other questions, I'm more than happy to help outside of this.
We got one more question.
All right, let's do one more for fun.
One more.
All right. So what is Thanos' favorite drink?
Oh no, what is it?
Snapple.
I appreciate the dad jokes.
All right. Thank you
very
so
for your time.
much.